We're going to be looking in this section about spirituality and what the nature of it is. It seems nowadays that there's been a trend and a resurgent interest in the whole topic of spirituality. Scores of books are being written on it. People are going to retreat centers. You open up the newspaper and it seems like people are interested in this topic. But where they're not going to largely is the church. And so I'd like to start off by asking my husband, John Ortberg, that question. What does it say about what people want, this whole resurgence of interest in spirituality? And then maybe later on take a look at why is it that people aren't coming to the church for the answers?
Well, I think that people are always fascinated by questions of spiritual reality. There's something about the nature of human beings that we want to know. Is this world, the things that we can see and touch, all there is, or is there some kind of transcendence? Rich Mao writes in one of his books about the desire that we have to re-enchant reality. You know, there was a day when people lived with the belief that the supernatural was all around them. And there's something that's real stultifying to the human spirit to think that there is nothing, there's no magic, there's no supernatural, there's no meaning. So I think people always have questions about meaning and about is there transcendent reality. But I think another part of it is most of us want to change. Now, I have this sense that there's a person that I was created to be, that, and you know this well about me, that
I'm not quite there yet.
I don't live up to that sense of being a joyful, memory-creating, truthful, courageous person like I want to be.
And I think when it happens, we get glimpses of it, and I long and ache inside to think, why can't my life be more like this all the time?
That's exactly right. I think, because part of my job is to talk a lot about spiritual life, and part of yours as well. One of the questions that I'll ask sometime is the life that I'm inviting people to live, is that the life that I'm living myself? Because I'll find often it's not. I remember we were having pictures taken of our kids one time at Kinderphoto, and it was a disaster. I don't know if you remember the day.
I remember it well.
They were all crying their brains out, and people watching us in the lobby, and their kids were crying.
Yes.
And optimism didn't work, bribery didn't work, threatening didn't work, and I finally pulled Mallory aside and said to her, Mallory, I bet right now more than anything you'd like to have baby tweezers.
That's her little doll.
Favorite doll. And she didn't even trust herself to talk. Just big tears in her eyes and her lower lip sticking way out. And I said, well, Mal, if you ever want to see baby tweezers alive again. And
it's one of your finer parenting moments.
It was one of those times when I realized I want to invite people to live the spiritual life, a life characterized by love and joy and peace and patience.
But that wasn't it.
Was not the life that I was living myself. And I think part of history's fascination with Jesus is that he came to invite the human race to live a certain kind of life, and that is life in the kingdom of God. But what fascinated people about him was the life that he invited people to live was the life that he lived himself.
That kind of life, living like Jesus lived, sounds very attractive to most of us. But I think what happens, especially in organized religion, is we move very quickly from that vibrant, vital, magnetic kind of life that Jesus calls us to live into this scared, reductive approach to spirituality that's about following rules. And our hearts get narrow and they get small, and we're not filled with joy, and we couldn't dare invite anybody to live that life because we're pretty miserable in it ourselves. And it just isn't full. So how do we understand that certainly there are rules to follow, but that spirituality is about more than that?
That's a great question. I think one of the constant processes that all of us have to be involved in is getting clarity on what is spiritual life. When you think about what Jesus did, a lot of it, he spent a great deal of his time, not so much teaching people what they didn't know, but trying to teach them that what they thought they knew was wrong. He spent a whole lot of time with especially religious types that had distorted ideas about spiritual life. And one of the great sentences of our time, I think, when it comes to people of faith, as Dallas Willard said, that distorted ideas of spirituality wrongly understood, is one of the primary sources of human misery and rebellion against God.
And that's the phrase Jesus used all the time. You have heard it said this, but I say to you this.
That's exactly right. So I think one of the places that it starts for us is to begin to seek to understand what is truly spiritual life. Because when people get distorted ideas about that, it becomes legalistic, or they just give up.
Okay, well, here's how I usually think about spiritual life. I think of my life in a big circle, cut into little pie slices, and I've got kids, and I've got you, and I've got a house, and I've got a job, and I have friends, and I have a slice of my life that's spiritual.
Yes.
Talk to me about that.
Another, I think, wonderful definition of spiritual life is just a way of talking about our life seen from God's perspective. Very often when people think about spiritual life, they will compartmentalize it into a few practices or a few things that they do. And one of the ways that I talk about that sometimes is that God isn't so much interested in something called your spiritual life. He's just interested in your life.
So for me, that pie chart would sort of be taking that wedge out that says spirituality and looking at that whole circle as my spiritual life. And it has different components in it, but there's not just a piece I can insert or take out that's spirituality.
What Jesus came to talk about, he doesn't often give kind of a mission statement. Every once in a while he does, and in one place in Scripture he says that I have come that you might have life. And I think that's what people are so hungry for. I think underneath all of the quest about spirituality is the desire that people have to be fully alive. And that sense of being fully alive, that abundance of life, is primarily what Jesus himself experienced, and that's why he was so magnetic, and that's what he invited us to enter into.
And there's something in me, even when you say that phrase, he's come that we might have life and have it abundantly.
Yeah.
There's a resonance inside of me that says that's what I want, that's what I was made for. But my experience in spirituality is so different.
Well,
so let's talk for a little bit about how we can view spirituality and use it in our life to make us drawn to that kind of a life where it's abundant. And then just the topic of what we're talking about today, that spiritual disciplines for ordinary people, I think we need not to rush past that too soon, the ordinary people part. I think one of the reasons we get stuck is that we begin to assume that this kind of life that we want to live is only for a select few. It's only for people who dedicate their entire lives to it, who go off into a monastery. And I think that's a roadblock and a barrier to us. One of the verses that speaks to this so well is out of Acts chapter 4. And you remember Peter and John, the day of Pentecost has just happened, and they're exploding the gospel all over the place. They've just gotten pulled in front of the Sanhedrin for preaching the gospel. And people are truly amazed at what is happening and what these men are capable of doing. And then verse 13 says this, when they saw the courage of Peter and John, now listen to this, and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. That's what we're talking about. It's available to unschooled, ordinary people, of which I feel like I'm in the middle of that category, and I'll bet you do too. It's not just for a select group of people. And the reason why they could be living lives that were astonishing to other people is because they had been with Jesus. And spiritual disciplines are a way to teach us to be with Jesus. So can you talk to me about how can I think of ways to arrange my life so that I can be with Jesus, so I can live life that's full?
That's great. I think it starts with getting clarity on what is it that Jesus was teaching. The old word for it is the gospel. That Greek word was euangelion, the good news. But to a large extent, I think in our day, that's kind of gotten lost. And if people think about the gospel at all, often they think about it in terms of kind of the minimal entrance requirements for getting into heaven. I have a friend who talks about what he calls barcode Christianity. And you know how when you go to a grocery store, you get a product and it's got a little barcode thing and the computer can scan it. But outside of the computer, you never know that it was on the product. People often think about the gospel as this assent that I give to certain beliefs that will enable me to slide over the counter into heaven when I get there. Well, the problem with that is that doesn't lead to life here and now. And when you go back to what Jesus actually said, it was that the gospel is that the kingdom of God, that is living in the reality of God's presence and his delight in you, that's available to ordinary people.
That's good news.
It is good news. It is good news. But for most of us, we don't know how do we arrange our lives in such a way that we actually enter into a life in the kingdom.
Okay. Some of the roadblocks, it feels like, when you say that, is I try it for a little while and then it gets hard and I give up.
Yeah.
Or I try it for a little while and it doesn't produce the results as fast as I want it to, so I stop and say, this isn't working.
Here's a very important point about spiritual disciplines, and we'll talk much more about exactly what they are in the next session. But spiritual disciplines are always a means to an end. They're never an end in themselves. They're never about my trying to prove to God how committed I am to Him. And for a lot of us in the church, I think a lot of people, we feel like I got to engage in a certain amount of spiritual practices just to show God that I'm committed to Him.
And that's the perspective that goes back to what we talked about a few minutes ago about just following rules for the sake of rules, and there's no life in it.
There's a very interesting point, a guy named James Dunn makes in his commentary to on the book of Romans. He says that in Jesus' day, the vast majority of rabbinical writings focused on 3 areas of the law: dietary laws, circumcision, not my favorite one, and Sabbath keeping. And then he asked the question, now why would they spend so much time writing on these 3 areas of the law? Because no devout Jewish scholar would have said that was the heart of the law. They all knew the heart of the law, Deuteronomy 6:4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Him shall you love with all your heart and mind and soul. They all knew that was the heart of it, so why did they spend all their time writing about circumcision, dietary laws, and Sabbath keeping? Well, to answer that question, Dunn talks about what sociologists call boundary markers or identity markers. The idea here is that all groups, we all tend to want to be exclusive. We want to know who's in my group and who's outside of my group. So we'll adopt boundary markers, real visible, relatively superficial ways to distinguish who's in my group and who's out, because I want to be able to separate the sheep from the goats. So, for example, if you're in San Francisco in the 1960s and next to you somebody's driving a Volkswagen minibus, and it's plastered with peace signs and bumper stickers that say "Make love, not war," and the driver's got long stringy hair and granny glasses, you'd be driving next to a
hippie.
Next to a hippie. If it was the 80s and you were driving next to somebody in a BMW, carefully moosed hair, Rolex watch, Gucci shoes, you'd be driving next to a
Yuppie.
because it's got all the boundary markers. All groups tend to have a biker's. What's a biker's favorite color?
Black.
There you go. Biker's favorite form of skin ornamentation?
Tattoo.
Tattoo. Those are just certain boundary markers that all groups have. Now, Dunn says, go back to the 1st century. Why is it that all of the writings of the religious leaders tended to be on circumcision, dietary laws, and Sabbath keeping? Because those were the boundary markers. Those were the way that they distinguished who is inside the people of God and who's outside the people of God. And so they spent enormous amounts of time and energy trying to work on the boundaries. And that's where rule keeping and legalism comes in. It's an attempt to answer the question, who is inside the people of God and who's outside? And here's what I think. I think that what God calls us to is transformation, to become people of love and joy and so on. I think when that doesn't happen, when people don't experience authentic transformation, inevitably spirituality will deteriorate into a search for boundary markers.
And there's no life in that.
No.
It seems like 2 things that would help us at this point is to understand what are your personal roadblocks to spirituality. We mentioned a couple just a minute ago. When you try for a while and nothing seems to be happening. When you try for a while and you just get weary in the trying and so you give up and you quit. Past experiences with different kinds of spirituality. I think people need to distinguish what are their individual roadblocks to spirituality. And then I think to rightly understand it, we all need to look at the nature of spiritual growth, or just the nature of growth in general. When we go through a time in our life when we have a great connection with God and we feel like we're learning things and our character is changing and we're more joyful and loving, that's a wonderful thing. But we squish the life out of that when we hang on to it and demand it, that be descriptive of our spiritual life all the time.
Yeah.
And that's not realistic.
Yeah.
And so the nature of understanding spiritual growth, I think, is that spiritual growth, like any other kind of growth, is usually fairly slow, somewhat imperceptible.
And we want to microwave maturity because
Yeah.
we're such a fast-paced culture.
And we have a time when it is microwaved, and that's addictive, and we think, that's what I want all the time, that should be normative.
Yeah.
But we'll have the experience where people will come over that haven't been around our kids for a couple of years, and they will notice the growth. It's been pretty imperceptible to us because we're around them all the time. But you look at plants, you look at kids, growth is slow. Sometimes it comes in spurts, sometimes it comes all at once. And I think we need to get a real good picture of that there are seasons of desert and dormancy, seasons of great rapid growth. It's all part of the picture and not demand that one slice of that be normative for all of our
Yeah, no, that's a
spiritual
great
growth.
point. I think to recognize there are stages of faith. People that work in developmental areas talk these days about stages of spiritual development. And the old language for that is, they used to talk about there are times of consolation and times of desolation. For example, very often when someone first becomes a Christian, that's an era of consolation. In those times, you want to connect with God. You pick up the Bible and it just comes alive. I want to read it. Sin looks bad to me. I'm not particularly tempted by stuff.
That all changes.
Yeah. I want to share my faith with other people. I want to work for justice in the world. I pray and it feels alive. And those times are wonderful. And I'm always tempted in those times of consolation, those mountaintop times, to think, well, this is going to last forever.
And that it should.
Yeah. And of course, it never does. And wise writers about spiritual life have always written about this cyclic nature of human life, that there are also times of desolation, times when we experience the desert, times when temptations look really good, and I pray and it feels like my prayers just bounce off the ceiling. And two very important things there are to recognize that it's not necessarily my fault that I'm in a time of desolation. Now, it may be. Maybe I'm involved in some kind of sin and I just need to repent.
Or you're not involved in spiritual disciplines that can transform you.
Right. But often God allows us to go into desert times because a kind of growth can happen then that doesn't happen when our emotions are kind of propping us up and supporting us.
And when we're not in the
life.
desert, we all know that. When we're in the desert, I think we question that.
Yeah. And part of why the church is so important to spiritual life, I think one of the great difficulties when people divorce spirituality from Christianity or from the church is it becomes a narcissistic search for individualistic fulfillment. I just want to have my own sense of spiritual transcendence that goes along with my material well-being and security and so on. We need to be in community, partly because when I'm going through a time of desolation, I need somebody else to pray for me and to remind me that I'm still loved by God.
And that just flips into then the essence of the kind of spirituality that we're talking about demands authenticity. I think when people go to a church or know people from a church and they see them living these happy lives of pretense, that everything's okay, the person that doesn't know God can't match their reality up with the way that person lives, and so that way of finding God is not interesting to them, so they go somewhere else. I think when churches become places of authenticity to say, I'm in a desert right now and this is really hard and I can't hear God and I don't want to talk to Him and I'm angry with Him. Not that we would ever say, boy, I hope you stay in that phase for the rest of your life, but recognize that's the reality of it right now. There's an authenticity that's very winsome and attractive to people, and they can match up their life with who God is, and it makes sense.
I think people are hungry to experience God. It's kind of interesting, 20 or 30 years ago, one of the best-selling books was called Knowing God by J.I. Packer. Now in our day, over the last few years, one of the biggest sellers has been a kind of a program called Experiencing God, because people don't want to just know about Him. They want to enter into life in that kingdom. Here's a question, though. I think a lot of people wonder when it comes to spiritual transformation, whose job is it? Sometimes people feel like, well, it's God's job. If I do anything, then I'd kind of be getting credit for myself, and so I'm not supposed to do anything. God's supposed to do it. And then other times people get almost militaristic about it. And we've experienced this, and we both know people who are kind of rigid, Marine-type Christians where they're trying to engineer it all on their own.
No offense intended to any of you that have had a past in the Marine Corps.
Thank you. No, I love the Marines. I think they're wonderful people, and I wouldn't want any of them to come visit Retribution on me. But whose job is it when it comes to spiritual growth? Is it God's job or my job?
Well, I don't think it's a simple answer. I think it's a paradox, and I don't think we're comfortable with paradoxes. Dallas Willard talks about that God he is opposed to earning, not effort. And there's certainly nothing that we can do on our side to earn God's love. But in response to it, when we are really filled up and understand how much God loves us, how much grace He's given us, there needs to be a response to that comes out of a genuine love, not out of a, I have to do this to make God pleased with me. So there's certainly, I've had many times in my life, especially when I'm in a desert, when I know there's no effort on my part that could make a difference. I've had amazing experiences where I feel like God has just intervened and broken bands around my heart where I was cynical or angry, and done a work in me that was just supernatural. I really had nothing to do with it. I didn't even offer myself. It wasn't even just simply, God, do with me what you will. It was, don't touch me, stay out of my life, you're making me mad. And still, he will work sometimes. And then sometimes when I have that experience, he doesn't. And then sometimes when I'm doing everything right and I've got disciplines going in my life and I'm making all kinds of effort, nothing happens.
Yeah.
And I think growth is this mystery of a both and, not an either or.
Yeah, I think there is mystery to it, and that's part of where discernment comes in. One of the analogies that gets used sometimes is it's a little bit like sailing. You know, when you're on a boat, if it's a motorboat, I'm in control. I decide where I'm going to go. I decide how fast I'm going to go. I can control it. If I'm just on a log raft, then I'm passive. All I do is hold on. But with sailing, there are certain things that I do. I'm not passive. I have to discern where's the wind blowing and how do I trim the sails and so on. But I'm utterly dependent on the wind. If the wind doesn't blow, I don't go anywhere. And Jesus has that statement in John where he says that the one who is born of the Spirit is like the wind. It blows wherever it will. So a part of my job, a part of your job in terms of spiritual growth, is to discern where's God at work in your life. And there may be a particular practice or discipline that God is really using to change me, and then I need to invest myself in it. Or maybe I'm kind of stagnant right now, and I need to be involved in other areas.
And I think in doing that, to couple that with what we talked about being ordinary people and the expectations that comes out of a learning time like that, is it may be something very simple. When we moved to Chicago 5 years ago, I'm a native Californian, and it was a very difficult move for me. And I think for the first year, I did nothing but complain about the weather, and the weather, and the weather. And that doesn't seem very spiritual.
And the topography, too.
Yeah, it was very flat.
Yeah.
For about a year and a half, about 18 months, that was my primary struggle in life. Now, to people that grew up in the Midwest, it seemed ridiculous. To most people, it seemed ridiculous. I was a bit embarrassed that this far into my Christian walk, that was so difficult for me. And for a year and a half, I wrestled with God. I was mad at him. I listened to him. I had conversations with people. I thought about it. I took walks. I looked out the window. And I feel like at the end of 18 months, I was left with one phrase. I feel like God said to me, you love California more than you love me. 18 months. And I thought, surely it would be something more profound than that. But when I sensed that sentence in my heart, I knew that's exactly what he was trying to say to me. It's a really small thing. It doesn't feel profound. I'm not going to write a book about it. People aren't going to come hear me talk about it. But God was concerned that in my heart, something was competing for his attention. And he had to break it loose. And that's a spiritual discipline for a very ordinary person.
Well, when it comes to responding to the movement of God in my life, how do I recognize and then respond to the movement of God in my life? That's where the whole business of spiritual disciplines come in. And I think one of the frustrations people have with spiritual life is there's a lot of great wisdom about spiritual disciplines that has been known in most centuries that for a variety of reasons in our day, people are just not aware of. So I think on our next session, we ought to talk more about what are these things called spiritual disciplines and how do I use them in a way that breathes life into me. So we'll see you then. In this session, we're talking about the whole idea of what spiritual disciplines are for and how they relate to ordinary people. That is a very important subject because the topic of change and transformation is so important in the church. I remember one man who I will call Hank, who had been attending church for a long time. By the time I knew Hank, he was a cranky old guy. And when he first started going to church, by all accounts, he was a cranky young guy. He'd been going to church for 50 or 60 years. But he was not able to effectively express love for people. He was not a very happy person. He did not experience or communicate joy. One of the famous moments in that church was the time when one of the leaders of the church came up to Hank and said to him, "Hank, are you happy?" And Hank thought about it for a minute, didn't change his expression or tone of voice, just said, "Yes." And this leader said to him, "Well then, Hank, tell your face." But apparently Hank never told his face because, at least as far as we could tell, it never found out about it. Now, the reason I mentioned that story is because at that church, as I was reflecting on Hank's situation, the thing that struck me was we didn't really expect Hank to change. Nobody was particularly bothered when change didn't happen. We did have certain expectations for him. We expected he would come to some church services and that he would know a certain amount about the Bible and that he would do some church work. Here's what we didn't expect. We did not expect that day by week, by month, by year, he would grow more progressively loving and joyful and patient and winsome. We did not think that he would live increasingly with Jesus' kind of character, which is what a disciple does. Nobody ever said, we ought to call an emergency meeting of the church elders and consider the strange case of the man who does church but doesn't change. So, Nance, let's start with this question. Why is it that you think in the church we tolerate a lack of transformation?
Well, let me back up right before that and just say, I think we need to realize that what you just described is the truth. And then we need to realize this is the way churches ought to be, this is the way churches are, and how do we fill in the gap? I think most people would, if their churches were a place where people like Hank grew and became more loving, more joyful, you would have a hard time keeping people out of churches like that. But that's not our experience. And most of us spend years going to church with the same people, and we stay the same people. Why is that? I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think, first of all, change is very threatening. As much as people talk about that they like change and that we live in a world of change, when it comes to us as people, we really don't want to change. It's too much work. We don't know where to start. It threatens us. So it's a lot of work. I think, second of all, it requires an inordinate amount of honesty about who we really are. And I think most of us aren't willing or in touch enough with that part of ourselves to be able to do that well. The Bible talks about that we're supposed to confess our sins to each other. It gives us permission to point out in each other areas in which we fall short. I don't know of many churches that actually use those practices in their communities and in their small groups. And so people just live with the status quo and they don't change.
I think one of the things that frustrates people a lot is I think most of us want to change at some level or another, but then a part of us resists changing or else we change. But a lot of people don't know, how do you pursue change? How do you pursue transformation? And this brings us to a huge subject, which is spiritual disciplines. Historically, the whole notion of spiritual disciplines has been a very important one. And there's a real fundamental distinction that can be very helpful when it comes to spiritual transformation. Paul makes it in a number of places. One of them is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, when he's talking about spiritual growth, and this is what he says. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training, he says. They do it, that is, they go into strict training to get a crown that will not last, but we do it, that is, we go into training to get a crown that will last forever. Now, the real important distinction here, and it's not original with me, people that are wise about spiritual life have understood it for a long time, is there's an enormous difference between training to do something versus trying to do something. Start with what Paul talks about, which is just physical activity. I remember, Nance, one time when you got a video of, I think it was Sylvester Stallone, it was an action video, and he kept hanging from mountains because it was a mountain climbing thing, and everybody else had parkas and jackets on, but he couldn't keep his shirt on. I was a little concerned that you got this video, and about the 5th time this happened, I looked, and his huge muscles bulging on the screen, and you looked at him and then looked at me and then looked at him and then looked at me and then kind of shook your head and said, you know, I've just never been attracted to well-built men. And
I meant something very different by that.
I'm sure. I knew it was a compliment,
right.
and I looked real hard for the compliment, but I just could never quite find it. But Paul says just start at the level of physical transformation if you're going to run a race. A lot of folks, if I were to ask you, could you run a marathon right now, you have to say no. If I were to ask you, could you run a marathon right now if you tried really, 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 really hard, the answer would still be no. But my guess is that for most of us, if we really wanted to, we'd be able to run a marathon, but what would we have to do first? We'd have to train. What does it mean to train? To train means you arrange your life around certain practices that enable you to do what you cannot now do by direct effort. Training means you arrange your life around certain practices that empower you to do what you can't do right now. And I'd say as a general rule, we tend to way overestimate what we can do by trying, but we way underestimate what we can do by training. And generally, Transformation in any significant area involves training. That's true for physical transformation. That's true academically if you want to learn a new discipline. That's true with music. And it's no less true when it comes to spiritual life. Paul says in another place to Timothy, train yourself unto godliness. Or Jesus says in Luke 6:40, no disciple is above the master, but every disciple, when fully trained, will be like the master. So this idea of spiritual training is a real important one, and it brings us to this phrase, spiritual disciplines. But that's a real interesting phrase. How do you find yourself responding when you hear the word spiritual disciplines?
I don't want to do it. It sounds like hard work. It sounds like no fun. It sounds like deprivation. It sounds like going on a diet or having to follow a rigid rule of exercise. It feels like you're going to take all the fun out of my life and make me do all of these things that I don't want to do, but I know I need to do.
I remember when I first read a book by Richard Foster, The Celebration of Disciplines, which was kind of a breakthrough book on this topic. And it's 12 chapters, each one on a different discipline. I did not like that book. I felt like I already feel guilty about not praying and reading the Bible enough, and now you're going to tell me there's 10 other things, and I got to feel guilty about all 10 of those before I have to master them before I can feel good about spiritual life. What do you think can enable people to overcome that sense of guilt when it comes to spiritual disciplines?
Well, I think it's the hope that disciplines give us for change. I mean, we talked a few minutes ago about why churches aren't places of change. It's hard work. We're not honest with each other about our faults. I think the third reason is we don't know how. We don't know how to change. And you want to change, but you don't know how to get there, so you just give up. Well, when somebody comes and begins to explain to you how your life can genuinely be transformed by the practice of the disciplines, relationships, and experiences in your life, you can truly live the kind of life that Jesus said was abundant. There's hope there. And I think it's that hope that presses me on to want to explore how I can use the disciplines in my life.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what spiritual disciplines are and start with what spiritual disciplines aren't, because I think people get on the wrong track when they start thinking wrongly about spiritual disciplines. First of all, spiritual disciplines are not things that I do to earn brownie points with God. God's not sitting up in heaven keeping track of how many disciplines I do and rewarding me on the basis of that. Again, God's not so much interested in something called your spiritual life. He's just interested in your life. Another thing that spiritual disciplines aren't, they're not necessarily unpleasant. I think for me, when I first heard that phrase, spiritual disciplines, I would think of an unpleasant thing. But of course, whether or not something counts as a discipline depends on what you're in training for. Like if I'm in training to run a race, I'll probably need to use a lot of running as a discipline. But if I'm in training to win a pie eating contest, the discipline I'll have to engage in is eating a lot of pie. And if I eat a lot of pie every day, a year from now, I'll be able to eat a lot more pie than I can eat right now by direct effort. Well, if what we're to be in training for is this life of love and patience and joy, then probably a fair amount of the practices that we'll need to be involved in will be things that we'll love to do and that will bring joy to us. So spiritual disciplines aren't things that I do to earn brownie points with God. They're not necessarily unpleasant things. They're not attempts to earn salvation. What a spiritual discipline is a practice that enables me to receive power from God to live the kind of life that He wants me to live. And always, spiritual disciplines are about freedom. When I'm engaged in a spiritual discipline, the purpose of it is to free me to be able to live life the way that I think God's calling me to live.
I think that's critical because I think Paul talks a lot in the New Testament about how we become slaves to sin.
Yes.
And we don't even see that we become slaves to it. That's part of why our lives feel hard and we don't see change. And I think the freedom word to associate with disciplines is so important because it cuts those ties and allows us to be who God created us to be. But sometimes we've lived so long the other way, we forget what it feels like to be free.
Well, it brings up a real important question. As people think about this business of spiritual disciplines, how can they get familiar with them? And how do you figure out which ones do I need to do? Because I think one of the things that happens a lot in churches is people start to compare themselves spiritually to other folks. And I'll start to think, well, if you pray this long or you engage in this particular practice, then I have to do it at least as much as you. Yeah. How do I know what's going to be helpful for me?
Well, I think that's part of what we talked about in one of the other sessions about authenticity, is you have to really know yourself first. And then I think with the nature of growth, you have to start slow. Pick one thing to work on for a while. Don't pick 7 or 8 things at once. I think you've defeated yourself before you've even started. So to pick one thing, one of the things that I do oftentimes will go to the book of Galatians and look at the list of the fruit of the Spirit and just pick one out of that list that I'm weak in and wrap one or two disciplines around that to see, can I get more? And for me, it's always patience. Every time I go to that list, it's always patience. What can I do in my life to grow in patience? When I was a young mom, and we had 3 kids in 3.5 years. Do you remember those 3 years?
I was there.
Oh my goodness. Before I had kids, I never thought of myself as an impatient person. I knew what a lot of my faults were. I think I was pretty objective. I could list faults, but impatience never showed up on the list. I had nothing to be impatient about. Once I had 3 little kids, all of a sudden I felt like everybody else needed me and wanted me, and I began to sense this growing impatience inside of me. Once my kids were old enough to start looking me back in the eyes with that disappointed look in mom being impatient was when I felt I experienced enough pain to say I want to do something different in my life. And I think that's a part of recognizing where areas of our lives are that we need to use and apply disciplines in. Where's their pain? Where am I causing hurt to other people? And I look at the kids when I would rush them or get frustrated easily, and I didn't like the look in their eyes. And I think I would do almost anything to be a different kind of person so that I didn't rush my children and I didn't get frustrated so easily. So I started, and you know, I'd love to sit here and say I enacted these 3 disciplines in my life and now I'm over that. It's not reality for me. But I grew in patience and am still growing in patience by beginning to put disciplines in practice in my life to slow me down and to not be in such a rush all the time.
In a sense, you almost have to think backwards about spiritual disciplines. The first question really is, what would it look like if I was living a kingdom kind of life? Because what can happen for some people, I think, is they separate spiritual life from their ordinary life. And so they think, well, as long as I am going to church and reading the Bible or so on, then God's happy with me, and I can kind of cross that off my list for the day. And then they may be very impatient or unloving folks, but they're not aware of the fact that they're not entering into a spiritual life. So the first question is...
And then they think, well, this whole God thing doesn't work because it
Yes.
doesn't change my life.
Yes, yeah. That's what happened with the scribes and the Pharisees a lot in Jesus' day.
I think disciplines are a way of inviting God off the list and into your life.
Yeah. So it starts with getting clearer on what does a kingdom kind of life look like. For instance, there's a statement in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. I always used to be very intimidated by that statement because I felt like, well, they know everything there is to know about the Bible, and they would give lots of money, and they fasted. And so I got to do more than they do, or I'm not even in a like entry-level position. Until one day I realized that from Jesus' perspective, they didn't have any righteousness at all. Because the essence of righteousness from Jesus' perspective was loving God and loving people. That's right at the heart of it. Well, they weren't even at first base on that one. So when he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, he's not setting the bar high, he's setting it really low at that point. Well, that all has to do with, I need to get clear on what does it look like to live a kingdom kind of life. Because if I'm distorted with that, then again, I'm pursuing spirituality wrongly understood, and it will lead to misery. And then a second question is, what are the particular sins that I wrestle with that keep me from living that kind of life? And that's where, like having children, one of the wonderful things that does is enable you to see sins that you couldn't see before. So that's the second question. And I'll wrestle with sins that you don't wrestle with. So my life's going to look different than yours. And then the third question is, what are the particular kind of practices and relationships and experiences that can help me overcome those barriers and enter into a full spiritual life?
So what are they? How do you do that? How do you work backwards?
A couple of really helpful books in this regard. One of them is by Richard Foster, The Celebration of Discipline, and he talks about some of the core disciplines. Another one is by Dallas Willard, and it's called The Spirit of the Disciplines. One of the ways that you can think about the spiritual disciplines is in one of two categories. There are what are called disciplines of abstinence, where I don't involve myself in things that I'm regularly involved in, like solitude would be a discipline of abstinence. Fasting, I would abstain from food. Silence, I would abstain from noise. And then there are disciplines of engagement. In those kinds, I enter into things that I don't normally do, like worship would be a discipline of engagement, or study, or fellowship. One of the points that Dallas Willard makes that I think is very helpful is there's also a way of categorizing sin in the two categories. There are sins of omission, where I'm not doing stuff that I should be doing, and then sins of commission, where I'm doing things that I ought to stop doing. And one of the things that he says is generally disciplines of abstinence will help me overcome sins of commission. For instance, let's say I have a problem with gossip. Well, if I practice silence, which is a discipline of abstinence, one of the wonderful things about that is I can't gossip. In fact, the church fathers used to say the number one reason why it's important to practice silence is it is so difficult to speak without sinning.
Well, you know, let's just land on one of them for a minute, like silence. Okay. And let's think of what are some of the weaknesses or faults or sins in our lives to which we would say, I need to go to silence. That needs to be one of them. You mentioned gossip.
Yes.
I think of another one of the need for attention. Maybe being in a meeting all the time and wanting credit for an idea or wanting people to pay attention to your idea. Maybe to engage that discipline and say, even when it's my idea and somebody else grabs credit for it, I'm going to let that go.
Here's a huge...
And not let it go and stew about it, but genuinely let it go.
Here's a huge issue that I wrestle with is impression management.
What do you mean by that?
Trying to manage other people's impression of me. I want people, especially if I consider them to be important people, to think that I'm smart enough or powerful enough or attractive enough. I'm way too concerned about what is it that people are thinking about me. And so I will say things, but part of what's leaking out is, as I'm saying something, I'm trying to make sure that I'm managing their impression so they're thinking rightly about me. And this kind of stuff happens all the time. Like, how often will I either say or hear somebody else say, if I'm talking about something I saw on television, I'll preface it with this comment. Of course, I hardly ever watch TV. Well, why do I say that? It's because I want to make sure they don't think of me as somebody who's just sitting on the sofa with nothing to do but eat bonbons and watch television. It's just impression management. Or kids, before they take a test at school, they'll say to another kid, I hardly had time to study for this test at all.
It covers both bases. So
yeah.
If you don't do well on the test, if you do well on the test.
If I don't do well, then it's because I didn't study. It's not because I'm not smart. If I do well, then I'm even smarter than you would have thought because I didn't even study for it. But that kind of positioning or constantly trying to make sure I get people to think of me rightly goes on all the time. I would love not to be that way.
So if you find that gossip is an issue, or impression management, or jealousy or envy, or the need for attention from other people, those would be things in your life. As you begin to notice them, and maybe that's the precursor to the disciplines, you have to be able to notice.
Oh, absolutely.
And call it a sin.
Yeah.
Instead of what I do, I rationalize it, I give it another name, I convince myself everybody's doing it so it's not quite as bad. When our kids were little, I had an experience where I described to you just sensing that I was growing in impatience with them. I'll bet I explained that scenario to 8 or 10 of my closest Christian friends, and every single one of them, to a person, said to me, you're being too hard on yourself. We're all like that. We all struggle with that. Well, there's a seed of truth in that was somewhat comforting. But I had one girlfriend who I called her on the phone and described the situation, and she got real quiet. And she simply said, I can see that. And it took my breath away. I think I had to hang up the phone and call her back later because it was like the secret was out, the cat was out of the bag. Everybody else was telling me it wasn't true. Sue gave me the gift of saying, I love you so much. I want to validate what you're feeling inside. Yes, you are. You do get impatient with your children. I'm not a yeller. I'm not a screamer. But I just had this growing sense of impatience. And Sue said, you're on the right track. You have identified with accuracy the problem. Now that you know the problem, you can move towards a solution.
Right.
It's like going to the doctor with a bunch of symptoms. He or she has to help you clarify it down to the key ones so that they can prescribe treatment. So we have to know ourselves really well. We have to be honest with ourselves and with each other. Identify what the problem is and then say, this is the discipline that I need right now for the next 6 months in my life to bring into my life to help overcome that. And that's where the hope lies. To be able to say, 6 months ago, I was much more impatient than I am today, knowing that, of course, we can always slip back. But there is great life in that, to say, I can be more like Christ. This works. And I think that's when the hard work feels like it's worth it, when you actually begin to see change.
There's a couple of kind of foundational practices that you were talking about that help give people wisdom for arranging their spiritual lives. One of them, the old language for it, is koinonia, or fellowship. And I grew up in the kind of church where fellowship tended to mean having red punch and cookies in the basement, but it's a much richer word than that. And what it really means is being deeply enough connected with people that they can help shed light on my life so I see who I really am and where I need change. So getting truth from other people is very important. And then also a discipline called self-examination. You know, the psalmist in Psalm 139 has that wonderful prayer at the end, "Search me, God, know my heart, try my thoughts, see if there's any offensive ways in me." A very helpful thing can be, at the end of each day, take about 5 minutes to just review the day. Look at how did it go when I woke up? What was I like then? What were the first moments of the day like? And go from one scene to the next. Where did I get things right? And where did I get things wrong? It's a bit like what football players do when they watch game films, so that they're always learning from every game. Well, when I examine myself and I have other people telling truth to me, then I can find out where do I need to change. And this is real important. Again, the connection between spiritual disciplines and transformation, that the goal of spiritual life is not to master disciplines. Sometimes I'll talk with folks and they'll think, well, okay, now I need to master silence or master fasting. That's not the deal.
That's a misuse of them already.
Absolutely. It'll get you off track. The goal is to live really well, to become a fully loving, joy-filled,
So it may
patient person who doesn't interrupt other people.
So it may be
Yes.
that I could actually say at some point in my life, I don't need these two disciplines right now because that part of my life is going fairly well.
If a discipline is not helping to transform you, for crying out loud, don't do it. We don't do them to get brownie points with God. We do them. They are to life what calisthenics are to the game. If a calisthenics will help you play a game well, do it. If it doesn't, don't bother with them. This is a helpful thing for me, is a good definition of what's a disciplined person. Because obviously to be a disciple is very closely related to being a disciplined person. The words are very closely related. What do you think of when you think of a disciplined person? Most of us think of highly rigid, structured, early morning, dull people. Well, here's my favorite definition of a disciplined person. A disciplined person is someone who is able to do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. A disciplined person is simply someone who is able to do the right thing at the right time in the right way. So that in basketball, a disciplined person is somebody who's able to make a free throw when it needs to get made. A disciplined parent is somebody who's able to say the right word or not say the right word at the right moment. And the reason we engage in spiritual disciplines is not to get our spiritual lives all organized. It's to be able to do the right thing in each moment.
One of the things I want to go back to, the progression that you laid out, I think is really important, that there are these factors that come together before we engage in the disciplines of self-examination,
Yes.
the work of the Holy Spirit, and this authentic community that churches can be about.
Yes.
To gather together and to speak the truth in love. The words that I described from Sue, I know she loves me. So when she said, I can see that, I heard it. I didn't get defensive, I didn't get angry, I didn't point the finger and say, she must be a bad person for saying that about me. I know she loves me, I know she knows me very well. So I take that information with the information I'm increasingly aware of, that I'm impatient with my children, and listen to the Holy Spirit and say, I've got to do something.
It brings up a great point. All of spiritual transformation does not hinge on spiritual disciplines. They're a very important part. But of course, I'm not the one that's bringing about change. God has to bring about change inside me. It's not my job. I have a certain role to play. And part of that has to do with spiritual disciplines. Another aspect, and you mentioned both of these other two before, another aspect is being involved in certain relationships. And I think we'll talk a little later on in this series about what's sometimes called spiritual direction.
And spiritual friendships.
Yes, having wise people that can feed truth back to us. And even relationships like having somebody in your life that's hard to love. One of the points that Jesus makes is, it's easy to think of yourself as a loving person when you're around people who like you and feed your ego and so on. The real test is, how are you with somebody that's difficult to love? And my guess is, if you don't have anybody like that in your life, your church probably has a list of hard-to-love people. And if you went to one of the pastors, you could get 2 or 3 of them. So relationships are very important. And then there are certain experiences that are not really spiritual disciplines, but without which we don't get transformed. For instance, we've done surveys at our church and asked people, when did you find yourself really growing spiritually and what factors were involved? The #1 answer was pain. When people are in seasons of suffering or difficulty, There's something about that that opens us up. And of course in Scripture, in places like James, it says when all kinds of trials and temptations crowd into your life, don't resent them as intruders, but welcome them as friends, because they can begin to produce qualities of endurance in you.
So it's relationships, experiences, and practices, which would be the disciplines, those three things
That's right.
that all work together to
That's right.
transform
And
us.
of course the practices are especially important because they're an area where we can take more initiative. Two of the very important spiritual disciplines or practices involve the use of Scripture and prayer. And we'll be turning to those in the next couple of sessions.